The other 30 Years' War, Part 3. Where we left off was two major powers had pretty much divided up the world. Germany, under the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler, they had partnered up with Italy, which sort of sparked all of this back in the 1920s. But by 1940, Italy really is more of a puppet government of Germany. And initially, Russia was the other major power in Europe. They had signed an agreement with the Germans, but in summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler invaded Russia. So now Russia is fighting the Germans. But right before that happened in 1940, Russia had basically taken Finland. Germany had controlled, in addition to others, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Holland, and was daily bombing England. They had also had an agreement with Switzerland, which wasn't really made public until many, many decades later. They also had an agreement with Spain, and they were already in northern Africa. So that's one side. The other major power, of course, was Japan, which by this point controlled almost all of the Pacific. They were in the Dutch East Indies. They were in New Guinea. They were getting ready to go into Australia. They were already in much of southern Asia. They were taking over about half of China by this point. They, of course, already had Korea going back to 1905 and Manchuria. They were getting ready to invade Russia, and they were just starting to invade India. These are the two major powers. The Second World War can really be divided up into two almost distinct wars. There is what we call two theaters to this war. There's the European theater, and then there's the Pacific theater. Now, if you really study World War II in depth, you actually kind of break it down a little bit further, because you have the Eastern Front and the Western Front of Europe, but there's also Northern Africa. But here I'm including that with number one. Pacific, you can do the same thing. You can look at the islands, but you can also specifically look at India. But for our purposes, there's two distinct theaters, and they're fought very differently. The tactics used, the outcomes of these are very, very different. So let's look at Europe first, the European theater, and we can really see this breakdown into four main stages. So the first stage is what's often called the Eastern Front. And this is basically what we're talking about is Russia. Again, summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler, not surprisingly, breaks yet another treaty. They had had an agreement with Russia that they would not fight each other. But the moment he gets a chance, Hitler immediately invades Russia. And he's really going to spend most of the war there. 90% of the German army is going to be in Russia. Keep that in mind as we get into the United States, going into Europe. And we fought a very bitter fight. We were only fighting about 10% of the German army by that point. The rest of them was fighting Russia. 20 million Russians are going to die on this Eastern Front. At least 10 million Germans are going to die on this Eastern Front. That's not including everybody else. In fact, if you really wanted to say where was World War II won in Europe, not to discount what we did, but the reality is it's the Eastern Front. You take the Eastern Front out, this is a very, very different war. So again, Russia, historically, there's a lot of resentment about this because, again, Adolf Hitler invades Russia. Now, keep in mind, Russia was incredibly aggressive before that happened. I mean, again, Russia made a deal with Hitler, so Russia is not innocent here. I don't want to give that impression. Again, they made a deal with Germany, and then they immediately tried to take over Finland, and they were hoping to take over a lot of these Eastern European countries. And of course, they're communists. They're led by Joseph Stalin, one of the worst leaders of all time. Their goal was eventually to take over the entire world. just like that was Hitler's goal, just like that was Japan's goal. This is like the one time where the world was ruled by these kind of James Bond-like supervillains. I mean, this is where movies like James Bond, or even later movies like kid movies like Despicable Me, this is where they get the idea of the supervillains. Those are all World War II leaders. Anyway, but as Russia and Germany are fighting, it is true that England and the United States do kind of hold off for a while from going in. We now know, as records have been released, that there were real conversations, like basically let the Germans and Russians just beat each other up for a while, and then we'll join the fight, which is good military policy, but from a moral, ethical viewpoint, that because you're talking about innocent lives being lost during this. But there's still a lot of resentment even today between Russia and the United States over this. Just know that. Sometimes when we're talking about Russian American politics, every so often this will still come up. Now, when and we haven't got much into the United States yet. So the United States doesn't really enter this war on the European side until late 1942, November of 1942. Of course, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, we haven't talked about the U.S. yet. And that's right. And so let's kind of hit pause here just for a second, because I really want to cover World War II fairly quickly as far as the actual military side of it. But we do need to kind of hit the pause button and back up a little bit and talk about the U.S. In this class, I've tried my best not to do much on the U.S. I mean, we most of you have had to take at least U.S. 1 or U.S. 2, and some of you may have taken both. You get American history all the time in school. I'm an American historian. I love it, but at the same time, we get enough of it. So I've been trying in this class to focus on everybody else. But at this point, we can't ignore the United States. We are one of the main powers by this point. And of course, at the end of this war, we are the power, which we will remain the main power all the way up until right now. So we have to, we're the elephant in the room that needs to be talked about. I mean, and basically the question is, where the hell are we? Why aren't we involved in this story? I mean, obviously we were involved in World War I, but even there, we're talking barely 2 years. We declare war in 1917. By 1919, we were, resolving the Versailles Treaty, and we're out of there, and we're done. So how do we get involved in this war? So we need to go back a little bit. And for once, we do need to talk a bit about American culture and American politics. So let's go back to the early 30s. So again, we fought in World War I, and the only reason we did that was because Germany had sent a telegram to Mexico. A guy named Arthur Zimmermann, who was the foreign secretary for Germany, sent a telegram to Mexico, because Mexico and the United States have had a rather unpleasant relationship. Again, sometimes today when we're talking about immigration and building a wall, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize that comes off very personal to many Mexicans and Mexican Americans, because of course Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Utah, parts of Nevada, and of course California, those were all part of Mexico. The Mexican state of New Mexico, the Mexican state of Texas, the Mexican state of California were all part of what used to be known as the United States of Mexico until 1845, when the United States invaded and took that. So Germany sort of, knew that. And so they decided to send a telegram to Mexico saying, hey, Mexico, if you invade the United States and take back that territory that you lost, we will help you. Which, by the way, Germany was not going to help Mexico. It was a ruse. What they were trying to do is just simply distract America from what was going on. By the way, Mexico said no. They thought about it for a day or two, but they did say no. But we intercepted that telegram, and it's known as the Zimmermann telegram. And that's really what officially got us involved in World War I. Anyway, I said all that just so I can now say this. So by the early 30s, many people, including many politicians, looked back. We were in the depths of the Great Depression by early 1930s. In fact, 1932 and 33 was the worst, where over a third of Americans were out of work. and there was sort of no end in sight. And as always, people are looking for someone to blame. We saw this in Japan, we see this in Italy, we see this in Germany, and in the United States, we're beginning to look for who's to blame for this. And whenever people are out of work and they're hurting, those who have the money start to get blamed. And of course, there were lots of big businesses, a lot of big businesses that had made money during the war. And which is true. Every war, businesses are going to make money. It's normal. So a conspiracy, it wasn't true, but a conspiracy developed that World War One was just the whole thing was fake. I mean, Hitler made the same argument, except in Hitler's case, he said it was the Jews that fooled us into getting involved in this. And I'm going to get into this a little bit. There's some of that in the U.S. as well. We were, a lot of Americans were anti-Semitic, but generally speaking, in the U.S., it was much more just simply that big business and a few politicians working together fooled us into going into this war. In fact, for a while, there was even a belief that the Zimmerman telegram was completely fake. It isn't. There's plenty of evidence it did. There's copies of it in Germany. There's copies of it in National Archives, Mexican Archives. It was not fake. But that was a rumor in the early 1930s. And in fact, there was a couple of committees in Congress to investigate in the early 30s. Why did we get involved in World War One? The most famous of these was the Nye Committee, led by Senator Gerald Nye, and it was inconclusive. They couldn't find exact evidence of a conspiracy, but they did indeed say that, well, we know big businesses made money, so perhaps big business fooled us into this. And the reason I say this is because it gives you a sense of the mindset of America and American leaders at this point. We were very anti anything to do with the rest of the world. We may have traded, in other words, we may have sold things to other countries and make money, but as far as politically getting involved, militarily getting involved, we were done. The idea was fool me once, we're not getting fooled again. We're not doing this again. And this goes a long way to explaining where is the United States while some of the worst atrocities in American and world history are happening. And even though we were in the Depression, again, nothing like what was happening in some of these other countries. And in fact, as the Nazis were rising to power, and I think I touched on this in part two, for a while, they actually started doing pretty good. They were building highways and developing new cars. And, because the dirty secret is that fascism, dictators, they do work in the short run. If everybody's on the same page and you have one person basically telling everybody what to do, you're going to get stuff done. Kingdoms get stuff done. Empires get stuff done. The downside is obviously individual freedom. There's atrocities, there's torture, there's horrible things that happen. But as far as getting stuff done, yeah, dictators can do that. All you got to do is look at the Middle East and, you can see that. So on the surface, a lot of Americans looked at Germany and said, actually, they're not doing too bad. They seem to be not knowing what was really happening, of course. So anyway, in 1935, the United States officially declares itself a neutral country. And the reason 1935 is because that's when Italy invaded, Ethiopia. In 31, of course, Japan had already invaded Manchuria. And then again, in 37, Japan is invading China. Germany is invading Czechoslovakia. There's a war happening, even though it hasn't been officially named a war. And so we declare ourselves neutral. We do it again in 1940, in fact. We're Switzerland. Switzerland is always the one country that's always neutral. And the reason they're always neutral is because they're surrounded by the Alps. It's actually very hard to invade Switzerland. So it's very easy for them to just say we're neutral. We were Switzerland at this point. And so there's an overwhelming sense of we don't want to get involved. And it literally is going to take a military attack on us for us to finally get involved. Although, as we'll see, in early 1941, we are starting to move towards war. But again, it's going to take the attack on Pearl Harbor. And again, to get a sense of how different America was, again, if you take US 2, or if you have taken history, you know this already. I mean, the United States before World War II was really not the same country we are today. You know, we were a white supremacist nation. I mean, I know we usually just say segregation, but the reality was we were white supremacists. So we lynched people of color. You know, women just barely had to vote, but they didn't have a lot of the same rights as other people. You know, we had been a slave nation less than 100 years earlier. So again, I think sometimes looking back at the 1930s is quite surprising. And yes, you do see if you look, you know, to the left and way in the back, yeah, those are German Nazi flags, and this is in the Midwest. There was indeed a small but, dare I say, thriving Nazi party in the U.S. and other groups that were Nazi-like, fascist-like. And again, when people are hurting, when a third of Americans are out of work, sometimes you get desperate. And also keep in mind, you know, to be fair, you know, now when you hear Nazis, we're thinking again World War II, we're thinking the Holocaust. You know, none of that was known in say 33 or 34. All you knew is that hey, you know, people in Germany seem to be doing pretty good. And again, a lot of white Americans did believe they were superior to other peoples. So yeah, to them it seemed kind of appealing. So you do have the American Nazi Party, and you have other groups that are Nazi-like that are, again, um, sort of organizing. Now, to be a little bit fair, you know, you know, you look at this image, and this is why I use this image because you see what's clearly the Nazi salute. And again, if you look at the kids, you know, they look just like the Nazi youth. But to be a little, and there is a Nazi flag. It's hard to see, but the third flag back is a Nazi flag. But to be a little bit fair, this is how all Americans saluted the flag. This is known as the Bellamy salute. Nowadays, you put your hand over your heart. Back originally, you did the Nazi salute. It used to be known as the Bellamy salute because a guy named Francis Bellamy came up with it for the American national pledge. And so you would point at the flag, and then you would point at your heart. And Hitler actually took which actually goes back to the Romans, really, but he took the Bellamy salute, and you know, and so now it's known as the Nazi salute. But they're not, but they're doing the Nazi salute. I mean, they're not, you know, they're doing it because Hitler did it. But there was groups like the German American Bund, which, you know, kind of portrayed itself as just a German American heritage group. But it was more than that. You know, I'm always a little funny. I mean, I'm very proudly Scottish American and Irish American and English American, and I have some Eastern European. You know, I'm very proud Southern, and of course, a proud American altogether. And there's nothing wrong with heritage, but I've always been a little uncomfortable with heritage groups like that because they so easily you can slip from being proud of your heritage to we're the best and everybody else is awful. You know, again, I'm patriot. I always say I'm a patriot, but I'm not a nationalist because nationalism kind of is like taking patriotism and then going a lot further with it. And again, a lot of these types of groups, you know, really were just cover for something much darker. And German American Bund is exactly that. You know, it was a very pro-Nazi group and pushing white supremacy, which again in America was much more common back then, but they were taking it a lot further than even, you know, groups like the KKK were doing as far as what they were hoping to see the world become. And so, you know, these groups were fairly popular. And again, they often portrayed themselves not as you know, they never said they were racist, you know. And again, one thing Hollywood always gets wrong about villains is that villains in real life never think of themselves as villains. You know, the movies are always like, I'm evil, I'm going to take over the world. And but people who really are evil often think they're the best people in the world. You know, and again, a lot of this is couched under this is just patriotism. This is a pro-American rally, a mass demonstration for true Americanism. Of course, it's that true, you know, what's not true? Native Americans, Jewish Americans, African American, you know, that's just code word for white America, Aryan Americans. But again, at the Madison Square Garden, you know, which is one of the big coliseums in New York City, I mean, over 30,000 people showed up for a rally in 1939. And yeah, that's George Washington celebrated as a fascist leader. And then you had other groups like the Christian Front. which were another pro-Nazi fascist group, but under the guise of Christianity. Which, by the way, um, sometimes it's, you hear people argue about religion and, and they'll say, atheists led to Stalin and Nazis, but that's actually not true. Actually, when you joined the Nazis, you actually swore allegiance to God, and they were very closely allied to religion. Again, religion can be used in so many different ways for good and evil, unfortunately. And yeah, groups like the Christian Front, but of course, why they call themselves the Christian Front? I mean, the KKK did the same thing with their burning crosses. They were basically saying we are anti-Jewish. And today, same way a lot of people talk about this is a Christian nation, so no Muslims should be here, and things like that. So this is not about religion, really. This is about supremacy here. And again, groups like the Nazi Party and the Christian Front and others, again, are taking a lot of the ideas of Germany, which was Nazi Germany is, we're proud Germans and we're restoring German pride. They would say the same thing. Here it says Nazis hailed George Washington as the first fascist. And he also had groups that were a lot, more overt, groups like the Black Legion, which were sort of the KKK, which is already a fascist group. The KKK and mixing it sort of more with, Nazis, which, I mean, these guys look like, this is like a little kid version I mean, every time I see it, I was like, this can't be, this wasn't a huge group. It numbered in the thousands, not the millions. But again, they were basically kind of a Nazi version of the KKK. There is a movie, and in fact, if I may not remember, but if I do remember, I'll try to send you a link. But there is an actual movie about the Black Legion starring Humphrey Bogart. That's a very critical movie. Hollywood used to not talk much about these things, but every so often a movie would come out. There was a movie criticizing the Black Legion. It's not very historically accurate, but it is a kind of an interesting artifact. So again, there were some Americans clearly not comfortable with this. I do want to make sure you know that most Americans, of course, 99% of Americans did not overtly support these kinds of things. But a lot of Americans allowed it to happen. And I think, didn't speak up. And of course, World War II is sort of the origin of the idea that I think is very important to remember, and that is, evil prevails when good people do nothing. And I think that's a good analogy for the United States in the 1930s. We were a good nation, but we didn't do anything. So it did allow for these little groups to spring up and thrive. But, again, so you had that side of it, the more overtly ugly side of it. But you also had this other side. Some of you may not recognize who this person is. This is a guy named Charles Lindbergh. He was known, he was a quote unquote American hero because in 1927 he did the first solo flight across the Atlantic, and later eventually would be the first person to fly around the world. It's funny, he's not very well known today in the same way. I think Amelia Earhart is much more famous. She was the first woman to do all of that. But if you go to the Smithsonian Museum of Air and Space, you'll see his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, there. But again, just like a lot of people who are big actors or great athletes, or they may be good at that one thing, but that doesn't mean they're good at anything else. But we tend in America, we love our celebrities, so we often go to celebrities and ask their opinions about stuff that they don't know anything about. I mean, YouTube is full of celebrities telling you how to be, healthier or something. I'm like, no, go to a doctor for that. Charles Lindbergh is an interesting case because he does seem to be incredibly naive. But on the other hand, he pushed some stuff that today would be very dark. He started talking about the America First movement, and he gave several speeches about this. We need to worry about our own problems. We don't need to save the world. We need to focus on our own problems. We got plenty of problems here. And if that sounds familiar, yeah, a lot of politicians talk like that today. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people like, why are we sending supplies to that country? They don't matter. Hell, I think, I think a lot of us, including perhaps myself, and I consider myself an internationalist, and yet, during this corona pandemic in the spring of 2020, I was sort of like, that's over in China. We don't need to worry about it. And guess what? Problems in other countries, if nothing's done, become problems here. And that's one of the big lessons we do learn, we, the United States, learned from World War II. But, this was an appealing message. We don't need to worry about other countries. But Lindbergh did take it a little bit further. He was a German American and he could fly. He had his own plane. So he did fly to Germany a lot in the late 30s. He met with Hitler several times. He met with Hermann Goering, the second in charge. He was given the highest medal a non-German could be given from the Nazis. He came back more than once and said, Hitler's nothing to worry about. He doesn't, he just wants a little extra room. We treated Germany horribly in World War I. They're just trying to restore their glory. That's it. They're nothing, he later will, by the way, I do have to acknowledge, he does apologize for some of this. He does realize that he was duped into some of this. But at the same time, even in 38, 39, even if you didn't want to get involved in war, by that point, it was clear that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and Benito Mussolini and these guys were not good guys to be hanging out with, right? One thing that has, and by the way, Charles Lindbergh later does, of course, support the United States during World War II. But this would be something that's always hung over his head. Was he secretly a Nazi? Probably not. But we do now know that he did have a secret wife in Germany, with whom he had several children. That's why he was flying to Germany all the time, and she was very actively part of the Nazi party. So anyway, for our purposes, that's just gossip, but for our purposes, Charles Lindbergh was a very influential voice, and there were many others at this point. And they were known as the America First Committee. And again, a lot of politicians were involved in this. They were very popular. And a lot of this, US 2, I go deeper into this, but some of these speeches do talk, in coded language about, they talk about the money lenders in the temple, and we got to run them out of the temple, which obviously is coming from the New Testament. But often, that was often anti-Semitic language. These what they really were saying is these Jewish bankers and these Jewish big business people. We got to watch those people. And so there was some really dark language here. Not to get into modern politics too much, but again, as a professor, I'm always trying to get you guys to kind of see the connections between today and the past. And you might remember that during 2016, there was a lot of talk from our current president, current as of 2020. I say that in case somebody's listening to this in 6 years or something. Donald Trump, and he often talked about America first and putting America first. And I guarantee he doesn't know anything about Charles Lindbergh or any of those people. I'm not making that. I want to be careful here. But for some of you, I remember during 2016, some of my students who liked Trump would say, why did everybody criticize him saying America first? And, and I had to explain, well, it's really because that phrase has such a connotation from people like Charles Lindbergh. That's why. So in case you're wondering, like if I was his advisor, I would say, maybe just reword it a little bit. Maybe not use that phrase. So, anyway, that's one of the reasons Trump's campaign was so controversial to some people. Anyway, enough of that. But there was this overwhelming attitude of we're not getting involved. In World War I, one of the big patriotic songs was Over There. In fact, you still hear it. If you're in a band, I'm sure you've played like a high school band. Over there, send our boys over there. Well, in 1940, the big hit was Let's Not Go Over There. I keep hoping I've never actually heard the song. I've only read about it. So I keep trying to find a copy of it. If anyone ever finds it, send it to me. But yeah, this was pretty much the attitude of the time. By 1941, though, American attitudes were beginning to change slowly. Franklin Roosevelt, the current president of the United States at that point, was elected for a record third term in 1940. By that point, Roosevelt knew we were going to have to get involved in this war because, again, by spring of 1941, again, Japan has taken over most of Asia. Germany has taken over all of Europe except for Russia, and Russia is starting to take over Finland. Of course, by summer of 41, Germany is going to invade Russia. The world was pretty dark, and whether we wanted to get involved or not, there was a sense that at some point it's going to happen. So we better get ready. And so using that idea of we need to at least get ready, and the idea that by getting ready, building up our military, in other words, that will help put people to work. He is able to start expanding the military at this point. But the real big moment for the U.S. was in spring of 41 with something known as the Lend-Lease Plan. So basically, the way Franklin Roosevelt came up with this, and to keep this short, he basically, when he told the American public about this, he said, if you imagine that your neighbor's house is on fire, and your neighbor comes to you, the fire is raging, and they knock on your door and they said, I need to borrow a garden hose. What do you do? And of course, the answer 99% of people say is, I'm going to let them borrow a garden hose. And why? Two reasons. One, that's your neighbor, and they're in need, and you want to be a good person. But two, if you don't let them borrow it and the house burns down, that fire is just going to come to you and it's going to burn your house down. So it's better to put it out at your neighbor's house before it even gets to your house. And then, of course, you're not going to like, hey, give me $10. You're going to just let them borrow it. And then afterwards, they're either going to give it back to you, or if it got messed up, they'll pay you for it. And using that core argument, he said, we, the United States, needs to start helping other countries out. We need to lend them stuff or at least lease it to them. But of course, who is he talking about? We're going to help out England. We're going to help out France. We're going to help out, after summer of 1941, Russia. We're going to help China out. In other words, we were supposed to be a neutral country, but in spring of 1941, we took a side. And we were anti-Nazi, anti-Japan, and anti-Italy. So we are no longer, we're not in war yet, but by spring of 41, we are no longer neutral. And Germany and Japan were paying attention. And again, after Russia gets invaded, they, even though they're still Russia led by Stalin, they for a while become an ally of ours. So, and I get into that a little bit in the Cold War lecture, but these are Russian children being fed with food from American farmers. Another thing we do in the summer of 41 is the federal government, at the urging of Franklin Roosevelt, embargoed oil from Japan. Embargo means we're not going to sell it to them. So Japan was an island country. It didn't have much of its own oil, but there's a lot of oil in the Pacific, but it was controlled by, for instance, in the Dutch East Indies or French Indonesia, places like that. But because we're over there, they don't want to get, they're a little hesitant to attack those places because they are worried about sparking a war with the U.S. They don't want us in this war. So in the summer of 41, because Japan has to have oil. People today, we argue whether we went into the Gulf, like in, say, 91 or, Iraq, did we go in there for oil? And the answer is, it may not have been our only reason, but absolutely. Of course we went to war for oil. And that's a terrible thing to say, but it's absolutely true. You have to have oil in this modern world. And so, yeah, Japan will, they need oil. They need oil for cars and planes and tanks and factories and such. And we were their main supplier. So when we stopped selling oil, that meant after a few months, they're going to run out and they're going to need to do something. So we had no idea that they were directly going to attack, say, Pearl Harbor, but we had an idea that this was going to lead to something. So again, we're not neutral anymore, even if we're not directly involved in this war. Also, in late 1940, summer of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt, the guy on the left sitting, met with the Prime Minister of Britain. It used to be a guy named Neville Chamberlain. He's the guy that made the deal with Hitler. The moment Hitler invaded Poland, Chamberlain was out of office, and he knew it. He resigned. He knew that he had screwed up. Chamberlain was not a bad guy. He just made a bad error. And Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of Britain. It's funny because Winston Churchill, he's probably the one prime minister that most Americans can name. He's in, he's in all kinds of movies. He's even in the show Doctor Who, and and of course, his mother was American, and so when he came to America, he would often play that up. I think I mentioned this in the Cold War lecture as well. But he always said that my better half is American, but he didn't mean it. He was about as British as they come. But he was good friends with Roosevelt. And again, Britain was the last country standing, basically, in Europe that was actually fighting Adolf Hitler. And so he was desperate to get help. And so he meets with Roosevelt to get help, and Roosevelt agrees. He says, I can't, he couldn't just flat out say we're going to go to war. But what Roosevelt agreed to was that if we get involved in this war, we will agree to help Europe first, then we'll worry about Japan. And of course, the irony is Japan is who attacked us. And what we end up doing is fighting two wars at one time. But we do agree. I'm not going to ask you all this on the exam. One lecture that I was planning to do in the spring of 2020, but I'm not going to do it now because of time. I know you guys already have way too many lectures, but I was going to do a whole thing about the United Nations. And just real quickly, the United Nations is, this idea of countries coming together, basically a redo of the League of Nations, really has its origins in this. This is from this agreement we eventually get the United Nations of today. So again, I'm not going to add, the only thing I really want you to know is the Europe first part, and that this is partly what got U.S. involved in the war. But you can look at some of the claims here. Basically it's saying that U.S. or United Kingdom is not going to go into this war to take over countries. We're going to let the people decide, self-determination, what they want. We're going to not stop trade. We're going to cooperate. We're going to help people from fear. We're going to make the seas free. This is basically the 14 points from Woodrow Wilson. These are those same basic ideas. And, by its fall of 41, it does look like the U.S. is about to get involved. In September of 41, a U.S. Navy ship was sunk by a German U-boat. They were patrolling the Atlantic. They pretty much controlled the Atlantic. And they were trying to stop us from helping England out. And so they sunk one of our ships. They really thought it was a British ship. And we really do think that it was a true accident because, again, Germany does not want us in this war. They apologized for it. Nobody died in that one. But then in October, another U.S. Navy ship was sunk, the USS Reuben James. And even though, again, it was actually probably a mistake, over 200 Americans would die in this. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt assumed that this would lead to war. He was getting ready to declare war, but the American public was still, as angry as they were about this, were not willing to go to war over this. But of course, a few months later, the moment that we embargoed oil from Japan, the leadership of Japan, at the order of Emperor Hirohito, they began to plan a surprise attack on the United States. And and in fact, of course, we now know it was the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Navy base on the U.S. territory of Hawaii. The guy who planned this, the military leader who was in charge of this, had actually spent time in the U.S. He went to college here, and he liked America, and he knew many Americans. And he kept, in fact, it was his idea to attack us on a Sunday morning, which is still kind of our most vulnerable time. But he warned the Japanese leadership, don't do this. You don't understand the U.S. They may be isolationists, but the moment they truly feel threatened, they're going to attack. He said, they went to war over a telegram. He warned, he said, if we do this, you'll have about 6 months, and that's it. And he was absolutely right. In fact, almost exactly. But the emperor and the others said, no, do it. So obviously December 7th, a Sunday, they attack our Navy base at Pearl Harbor, and the next day, the United States declares war on Japan. Of course, there was a problem. We were supposed to, I go ahead and flip slides here. We were supposed to go after Europe first, but Europe didn't attack us. But on December 9th, Adolf Hitler, probably the only treaty it ever actually honored, because they had an agreement with Japan and Italy that any country that one is at war with, the other two will go to war with. On December 9th, Adolf Hitler also declares war on the United States, and so does Italy. Mussolini, nobody cared about. It's like a little kid going, me too! But Mussolini also declared war. So now, we're in a two-front war, a war against Japan and a war against Italy and Germany and Europe. 6 months, and again, there's a lot of stuff in the U.S. side, but we're not going to get into it. Within 6 months, there's the Battle of Midway. This is supposed to be another surprise attack on our island of Midway, which is literally midway between North America and Asia. We had a major base there, but by that point, just a few months later, we were already cracking their codes, and we figured out what they were doing. And so when they went to attack us, we actually counterattacked. and virtually destroyed Japan's Air Force and destroyed a huge part of its Navy. This was the first major U.S. victory, and it will be, from this point on, every battle in the Pacific will be a U.S. victory. So for the Pacific side, this is already the turning point. 6 months in, and the war's already turned. Although, to be fair, in June of 1942, nobody knew that this was the turning point. But looking back now, we're like, this is that moment. And so in summer of 42, this is what the Japanese Empire looked like. The red line, you can see Midway right there on the right. That is as big as their empire got. It eventually will start shrinking, you know. And so the way we went after Japan in the Pacific, just to keep this fairly short, I know I say that every time, and every lecture goes on for 20 hours, but we follow something called an island hopping campaign. So again, most of the Japanese Empire, including the nation of Japan, was really a series of islands. And so the islands are very vulnerable because they can be surrounded. They're usually have to bring stuff from the outside in. So what we did was sort of, if you know anything about the American Civil War and the Anaconda Plan, we decided to do our best to cut them off. So cut off oil, figure out where the oil is in the Pacific, make sure they don't get there, figure out how they're communicating, cut that off, cut off travel routes, shipping routes. You don't have to attack every island, but you take the specific ones, which is why in the Pacific it is a series of island battles, Okinawa and Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, right? And ultimately, this worked. For the most part, this ultimately is how we win the war in the Pacific. And in Europe, this is what it looks like. Pretty much, the Nazis have pretty much controlled all of Europe. You got Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal as neutral countries, but the reality was they had all made agreements with Nazi Germany at this point. And of course, Nazi Germany is invading Russia at this point, and again, what we call the Eastern Front. But if you notice at the bottom, this little blue spot, that's Northern Africa, even though officially it was part of what was known as Vichy France. So when France surrendered to the Germans, they basically, a puppet government was formed known as the Vichy government. And so it really was just part of Germany. They were almost like a state of Germany. But they officially are the ones that controlled Northern Africa because they as a nation, that was part of their empire. So now that's part of the Nazi empire. So we, the United States, we're ready to invade, but Churchill is like, no, I know I wanted you in this war, but if you do it too quickly, you're going to be in trouble. In fact, in Belgium, a couple of years earlier, the English had invaded Europe to try to get rid of the Nazis, and they failed. And they almost lost their entire army. And some of you may know this, but they're at a place called Dunkirk. Believe it or not, the English army was able to escape. Nobody could. It was known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. There's a great film about that. Came out about 2 years ago. But they just barely made it. And so England was very cautious. Again, getting involved. And also Churchill was like, hey, look, let them beat them. Let them go at each other in Russia. Come on, let them beat each other up. But the United States wanted to at least get involved in some way. So the agreement was we're going to get involved in Northern Africa. We will invade Northern Africa and at least take that from Germany. And plus the argument was maybe that will help Russia a little bit. Maybe it'll divert some of the attention from Russia. So that was really our first major involvement in World War II in Europe. Was we went into again Northern Africa, and from Northern Africa we jumped right into Italy. So again, we took Northern Africa, and you can see Italy is just right above it. Benito Mussolini, although again by this point pretty much controlled completely by Germany, but we decided to invade Italy. And the thought was this is going to be really easy, but if you know anything about the history of World War II, this was actually some of the most brutal fighting for the United States. Churchill called it the soft underbelly of the Nazi Empire, but people like General Patton later referred to it as the tough old gut, because it did turn out to be a much tougher fight than people realized. And then, of course, finally, it takes all the way to 1944, but we decide to open up what we call the Western Front. And it's usually referred to as D-Day. D-Day itself doesn't really mean anything. It's just sort of a code word for the invasion. The Pacific War had, dozens of quote unquote D-Days. But whenever you say D-Day, we all know you mean this one. So this is where, if you, again, you see where England is, just off the coast of England, going into northern France, an area known as Normandy. That's what's going on here, the invasion of Normandy. And in fact, the United States was, along with the United Kingdom, was really the main powers. But, there were lots of other countries involved. In fact, Canada, there were 5 separate beaches that troops landed on. I mean, Canada had one of those beaches. I do feel like Canada, it was Sword, Juneau, Gold, Utah, and Omaha. Omaha was the bloodiest, and that's the one that we did. And that is the one that usually all the movies are made of. A third of all the deaths during this invasion of D-Day happened at Omaha Beach. But again, there were other countries involved in this as well. It is the largest attack at one time. The amount of planning involved, the amount of money, the amount of soldiers involved. And again, an amphibious attack means going from water to land, right? And so this is again the official opening up of the Western Front. Something that, again, Russia to this day say we waited way too long to do. Now, we did have to get ready for this. But at the same time, there is some evidence that we did maybe wait longer than we needed to do that. And so the idea at this point is to crush Germany. So on one side, Russia's pushing from the east to the west, and we're going to be pushing from the west to the east, and we're going to crush Germany in between. So again, D-Day was very successful. Within a day, we had already taken the beaches. Within a month, 1 million soldiers were already, American soldiers were already in Europe. So this is incredible. And over the next several months, all the way to the spring of 45, we are slowly just pushing the Germans back. Keep in mind, 90% of the German army was in Russia, Anyway, once we invade on D-Day, the war is practically over in Europe. I mean, it takes 9 months of brutal fighting, but it is over. But before it's completely over, in the U.S., a major event happens, and that was the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Not too far away from Bainbridge State College, back at Bainbridge, but up in Warm Springs, Georgia, sometimes known as the Little White House. He had a massive brain stroke, and then a few minutes later died. And this is probably the most famous photograph from this period. This is actually at Warm Springs, and it does kind of, I think really illustrates this outpouring of emotion. Even if they didn't like him, the guy was president for 12 years by this point, and really had basically led us to victory. And for a lot of people, their whole lives was one president, and again, the war wasn't over with yet, and there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty as well. And again, as many of you know, he was sitting for a painting. It was never officially finished. And he said, I have a splitting headache. And the artist, she and another woman took him. None of them were his wife, by the way. Took him to the bedroom, and a few minutes later, he died. But he was incredibly ill by this point. He shouldn't. I love Franklin Roosevelt, but he should never, ever have run for a 4th term. He was in horrible health, and it was inevitable he was going to die during that term. And of course, the person who was president now was a guy named Harry Truman from Missouri, somebody who had just become vice president. Franklin Roosevelt had had a couple of other vice presidents, and he had just joined in November of 1944, the election, and he was totally kept out of the loop. So he had no idea what the United States was doing behind the scenes. And of course, as you may know later, he had to make one of the worst decisions any humans ever had to make, and that is, do I use the atomic bomb? A secret weapon he didn't even know about in April of 1945 when he became president. Of course, again, by that point, in Europe, it was all but over. This is one of the last known photographs of Adolf Hitler. By this point, he was 56. So not really that old, but he looked 20 years older than that. We now know he was suffering from several ailments. He also had a major drug addiction, a lot of different things, including speed that he was getting from his doctor. He was definitely not in his right mind by this point. Um, but yet at the same time, um, that's not to absolve him at all. He had led the world into a major world war just barely 20 years after the first one. He, and again, by spring of 1945, he knew it was over. He knew that it was all done. So what does he do? Does he tell everybody, okay, go home, we're not going to win, put your guns down, go home, go back to your families? No, he wants them to fight harder. He left a will, and we know a lot of what he said. There's a lot of recordings of what he said at this point. Who does he blame? Not himself, of course, not his fault. Of course, he's blaming the Jews, but he's also blaming the German people themselves. In fact, at one point he says, they don't deserve me. I'm a great leader, and these people don't deserve me. At one point, he talked about just destroying everything in Germany to punish the German people, and so that all the other people who are coming into Germany can't get any of it, despite everybody. And of course, as most of you know, he ultimately committed suicide. He married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, and then they both jointly committed suicide. And of course, some people say, oh, yeah, because he was tough, but to me, and I don't want to talk about suicide in this way, generally speaking, because I know suicide is unfortunately a product of mental illness in many cases. But at least in this case, I would argue this was an act of cowardice because instead of facing a loss and facing his punishment, he just, and facing the wrath of his own people, he just killed, okay, I'm out of here. Leaving behind basically his own people to suffer the consequences. And they are going to suffer some of the worst consequences as the Russians are coming in. One of the things he did in those last few months before he ended up committing suicide in the bunker, he was hiding away in this little bunker, which is where he spent the last few months of the war. Instead of, again, sending people home, he sent more people. He sent elderly people 60s and 70s, put them in uniform. And for Berlin itself, because the Russians were about to come in, to defend Berlin, he sent literally children, put them in uniforms. This is a late photograph, again, still trying to say, no, we're going to win. This is a propaganda photograph, I think from February of 45, showing the new soldiers that are going to defend Berlin. These are kids. And some of the worst fighting. I know I say that about everything, but when the Russians came into Berlin, they were taking revenge. And again, I talked about the rape of Nanking with what Japan did to China. The same kind of stuff was happening in Berlin. It's still not completely well known, I think, by many people, what the Russians did to the Germans when they came in. And again, it's these kids that were facing a lot of that wrath. This is a series of photographs that's very heartbreaking to me. It always has been, but now that I'm a dad, I have a son who's a teenager. It gets me even more. This was a German soldier, and who, in this case, Americans, basically forced him to surrender. In that moment, he was angry. I've lost, but then the emotion starts to hit him. That I'm going to live. I mean, there's a sense of loss, but the sense of I'm going to live, and you can just see this kid just breaking down. Uh, this is Adolf Hitler's legacy right here. So who's in charge now? Because Germany has not surrendered. Hitler just takes himself out of the equation. Initially, it was supposed to be Hermann Goering, who was a big World War I hero. He was a major pilot. He was good friends with Charles Lindbergh, and he was the number 2 in charge at this point. But Hitler didn't trust anybody, and right before he died, he actually said, this guy is not going to be my successor. But he claimed to be the successor after Hitler died, but again, officially, he was not. And that was a guy named Karl Dönitz. The guy on the right was officially the guy who was the successor to Hitler. He was the Grand Admiral, as he was called. He was also the president of Germany by this point, the head of the government. And so he ordered Alfred Jodl to actually surrender. Once Hitler was dead, he was like, Jodl, it's time to surrender. So General Jodl does surrender. Hermann Goering later will also surrender, but this was the one that mattered because they are officially surrendering Germany to the U.S. And we get what's known as VE Day, Victory over Europe Day, May 8th. And May 9th, it was Russia's version of that, because May 9th, forces officially surrendered to the Russians as well. This is a photograph, one of my favorites. I just blame Hitler for sending kids in. We didn't send officially 15-year-olds in, but even 18, 19 are pretty young. And these are American soldiers serving in London at this point, celebrating. But at this point, we're still fighting a war with Japan, and it really does remind you how young American soldiers really were. Movies always show them; they're always old in the movies, but they were very young. These kids look like they can't even shave yet. And in this case, they've avoided fighting in Europe, but at this point, May of 45, the thought was they're still going to have to fight in Japan. Turns out they're not going to have to, but they're not sure about that. So again, we do forget how young people are in wars. So what happened to Mussolini? Well, Mussolini at one point had already been captured by the Allies. And because, again, Italy was invaded in 43. Hitler actually, this was his idol. So Adolf Hitler kind of helps his friend out, his idol out. So he does send some Germans in to break him out of prison and rescues him. And that's what happened here, is him in the German stronghold. And eventually Mussolini tries to get back into Italy and kind of reorganize Italy. He has pockets of Italy that he controls. This is he and his companion. But at the end of the war, he's eventually captured by his own people. Today does have this big mausoleum in his honor. But what actually ended up happening is what happened to many fascist leaders. The crowd, he was trying to escape. He was at an Esso gas station of all places, and he was captured. He was brutally beaten along with his companion and some of his other people traveling with him, and eventually hung up, dead, lynched, if you will. You can see he and his companion right to his right. This is what ultimately happened to Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism and the inspiration for Nazi Germany. And then, of course, in late summer, we get what's known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And the reason I have two dates, and this gets into, kind of a historical debate, on basically August 15th, really Japan is over with. They had officially surrendered. The United States forces actually went into Japan, but the actual signing of it didn't actually happen until September 3rd on the U.S. ship USS Missouri. That ship in particular, because that's the home state of Harry Truman. By the way, May 8th was Harry Truman's birthday. So, officially war is over with, but I want to back up a little bit and get a little deeper into some of what happened in this war. Not so much the military battles, but the deeper issues here. As you can already see, a lot of what we've talked about in this class are all kind of coming together in World War II. Issues of race, issues of social Darwinism and science and technology and vaccinations, nationalism, empires. I mean, this is when all of these threads come together. And I really want to look a little bit at this issue of race, because World War II is unlike, I think, any other war. Not just the size of it, but the implications of race, the biological elements of this war. Race has been there already, but this modern idea of race as these biological differences changed the nature of this war. Again, anywhere from 55, but I think most estimates now are as many as 70 million people died in this war. I mean, we're seeing entire cities destroyed. And one of the answers to that is not just technology, but the fact that there is this other element here, this total war against other people. And we know the Nazis did it. We know Japan did this, but we can't come, and we know the Russians did it to the Germans. But but there's also this other element. Even in the U.S., there's a bit of this, especially with Japan itself. And you can see this in the propaganda against Japan, that it wasn't just about the country of Japan. It was about the people of Japan. And we don't often call this a race war, but I think there are elements of a war between races in addition to a war between countries. And so this issue of race and war is still, I think, the story of World War II now. You know, it's the legacy of World War II. And I thought, because this gets into a couple of issues, I thought I'd talk about this guy for a second. I have a couple of clips of him that I'm going to send you guys. This is a guy named David Irving. David Irving was a historian, a British historian. He didn't go to grad school. But he got to be, he was actually, you know, he knew what he was doing. In fact, his mastery of German documents was unparalleled. And he wrote several books. If you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which talks a little bit about the Allied meaning Britain and U.S., the Allied bombing of the German city of Dresden, which is a horrendous bombing, you know, and it is one of those events that America has often been criticized for because, again, we were bombing a city. It wasn't just the army. I mean, it was kids and old people dying, you know, orphanages being bombed. And Kurt Vonnegut was a prisoner of war during that in Dresden, and he saw it himself. And again, if you've never read it, the novel Slaughterhouse-Five is a strange novel. I love it, but it's a strange novel. But it's about the horrors of war and the dehumanization of war. Well, part of that, even though he was there, part of that novel was based on Irving's history of the bombing of Dresden. And in fact, that was kind of the official narrative of that bombing. And it was a classic work of history. And then he later wrote a biography of Goering. Then he also wrote a book called Hitler's War, which really was kind of a narrative of what Hitler did in that war. And by Hitler's War, that came out, I think, in '79, people started going, I mean, a lot of it was accurate, and, you know, but some people are starting to raise some eyebrows, you know, and Irving makes this argument that, you know, Hitler probably didn't know anything about the Holocaust, and there's clearly no official documents of the Holocaust. There's no order given. So if it did happen, he doesn't quite say it that way. He wasn't that blunt, but he said, you know, it clearly happened below Hitler. You know, he's clearly kind of absolving Hitler of a lot of responsibility. Then by the late 1980s, you know, he wrote some other books, and by that point there were some whispers like, wait a minute, David Irving, is he pro-Nazi? You know, and then by the late 80s, he had gone to some meetings where people had videotaped, and he was clearly denying the Holocaust. And by the 90s, he kind of was out of the closet. Yes, I don't think the Holocaust happened. Hitler was not a bad guy, you know. And then looking back at things like his book on Dresden, you're like, it was a horrific event, and you know, but when people reread it and actually started looking at the sources, it was like, oh, this is not just a history of Dresden. This is a kind of almost a propaganda book about how bad America was and how good the Germans really were. And today, he's still alive, at least as of 2020. He lives down in Key West, Florida, of all places. And he is very openly anti-Semitic. He's very openly a Holocaust denier and all of this. The one good thing I think Irving has done, by the way, a woman from Georgia actually wrote a biography of him, a very scathing biography about his denials of history. And in fact, that was the name of the book, Denial of History. And he sued her for slander. And it went all the way to a federal court, and she won because she proved that his use of documents was very devious. It actually, you know, he was trying to, you know, ruin her, and it actually ended up ruining him. And of course, that's a story, and I'm just fascinated by that. But the reason you know, and he's just one of many, unfortunately. And I do fear, as the living memory of World War II is going away, there's very few people today who were alive during World War II. And the ones who are, most of them, like him, were just little kids during World War II. And as even they began to die, what are future people going to think about this? Because, you know, in the same way people deny things from 200 years ago, or, you know, like the flat earth myth, right? You know, we're going to start hearing people talk about the Holocaust myth, which I think means historians need to make sure we're documenting things well so people don't forget, right? But this gets into another issue, and this is for those, at least in my spring 2020 classes, because again, later classes may be listening to this as well. But for my spring 2020 class, your part of your discussion is about Irving and ideas of free speech, because a little bit later, Irving was in Germany. Germany is very strict about how you talk about World War II. And they're very open about what they did wrong. They don't hide it at all. Japan, very different story. Japan does not talk about their atrocities that they did. Germany does. But Germany is also a modern nation and a nation that believes in free speech and all this. And this is where it gets interesting as Americans. He was arrested and actually spent time in prison for talking about the Holocaust in a way. Today, by the way, he says it happened, but it was just very small. Not that many people died. It's these Jewish peoples that are making money off of it. And, it's just very ugly. But this gets into an issue that I bring up every semester, and I'm always interested in this because I very much believe in free speech myself. But free speech means free speech. And so David Irving is one of these cases where you go, oh, crap. So should David Irving be allowed to say what he says? Or are there limits to free speech? And who sets those limits? And that gets really uncomfortable, when you start getting into hateful language and racial language or language that, is clearly untrue when you're talking about things from the past that, you're just making stuff up, it gets, and of course now in the last few years, a lot of talk of alternative facts and fake news. And he's an interesting conundrum. Should he have gone to prison if you believe in free speech? Should he be allowed to say what he says? But then it's so distasteful and it's so awful. Ooh, and that's why I'm having you guys discuss it, because I think it forces you to confront, well, what do you believe? And, if you believe in free speech, do you allow this guy? Anyway, enough of that. Enough of it. Way too much of David Irving. I do have a couple of clips of him where basically a reporter pranked him, and you do hear how hateful this guy really is. Anyway. But when you look at what happened, for instance, in Stalingrad or Leningrad, later St. Peter's, renamed back to its original name of St. Petersburg, and you realize what the Germans did to the Russians, and it was bordering literally on genocide. But then you see what also the Russians did to the innocent Germans, because even though you have Hitler, it doesn't mean every little baby in Germany was a Nazi, and this is actually Berlin, and you can see. I mean, it was just, and by the way, we did a lot of this too, because we were bombing the hell out of Germany and the German strongholds. And, but on the Russia side, between the Russians and Germans, it was down to that racial level. And again, this is not a Holocaust image. This is actually Germans in Berlin after bombings. It is, this is what total war really looks like. And again, we've never seen destruction of this level before. And again, why? And again, some of that is technology, the impersonal nature of these weapons, but it also gets into this biological element that those people aren't me. So it's okay if they die, and I can treat them in the same way I treat animals. Again, there's the Holocaust at sort of the top of all of this, and I don't want to equate everything else back to that, but at the same time, there are levels here, and it is a very uncomfortable conversation to have. But like I said, if you ever get a chance to read about the fall of Berlin, it is just the amounts of murder, destruction, sexual crimes, rapes, just unbelievable what was happening in the fall of Berlin. And of course, this is for the next lecture. This is also the beginning of the Cold War, because when the Russians come in, they're not leaving. This is when Germany becomes East and West Germany, and Berlin becomes East and West Berlin, because as on one hand, it's the liberation of Europe, but really what it is one empire is being taken over by another empire. Instead of the Nazi Empire, it's the Soviet Empire, the Communist Empire. And that's and again, at the time, it was portrayed in our news as, look, the liberation of Russia, the liberation of Germany and the defeat of Hitler. But what today we can go, oh, this is just the next empire conquering. This is the Reichstag, by the way. This is the legislature of Germany after the Russians were done with it. But I think for our purposes, I'm more interested almost for right this second on what's happening in the Pacific side, because the Pacific side, I think, is where, other than the Holocaust, which we're going to talk about in a moment, I think the Pacific side of the war is where it's the most blatant, most obvious. So if you look at the United States, and keep in mind, we were furious at Pearl Harbor. And we do have to put this into context, but at the same time, if you look at the propaganda, government posters, films, speeches, it's very obvious that we talked about Japan in a very different way than we talked about, say, Germany or Italy or Russia. Often portrayed as animals. I mean, of course, in this image, we're the eagle, of course, but very often portrayed as animals. But it was very much as a race. Even Japanese Americans, people who were born here, spoke English. In fact, in some cases, only spoke English. Even we considered to be not really one of us. They're always suspect because they're Japanese, that they are, again, a separate race, if you will. And again, propaganda fascinates me, and this is very typical. You have the Japanese soldier. Again, notice it's just a generic Japanese soldier with this simian ape-like mouth, the long fingernails, and of course not a gun, but a knife. It gets more savage, more primitive, but also the hint at sexual violence. Some of this is coming because of what Japan did in China, but in the United States, if you look at, for instance, anti-African American, like during lynchings in the South, it was almost always for the violation of a white woman, and you see that same gendered sexual imagery in a lot of the propaganda, because the idea that phallic knife isn't just about murder, it's about something sexual. Again, knife, woman. Again, the Japanese portrayed almost with dark skin. This is primitive. This is savage. And almost always we portray Germany or Italy as the leaders. Mussolini, Hitler, Japanese soldier. Again, Hitler, we're after him. Here's Hitler again, Japanese soldier. And again, with the bloody knife. Partly they stabbed us in the back of Pearl Harbor, but again, there's something more savage about this. There's more primal about them versus the more civilized Germans. And again, a lot of the propaganda is very clear. I mean, they're almost portrayed in the same way as though they're African Americans. Again, remember, this is when African Americans were still segregated against in the U.S. I think I cut off is it a conundrum for the world, and basically the civilized world trying to figure out this clearly mentally and physically inferior Japanese race, and what are we going to do with them? And again, this is right after Pearl Harbor, but the view of them over and over again as almost like animals as opposed to fellow humans. Again, often apes or monkey imagery. And this is probably the most controversial cartoon. And should civilization simply take out the Japanese? And there are some people that were really making this argument. By the way, Japan, as I said earlier, I love Japanese culture. Maybe not as big as some of you guys, but I like anime. I grew up with Godzilla films. I love Akira Kurosawa movies. I'm fascinated by Japanese culture. My son loves Japanese culture. I know a lot of you do too as well. And Japan today is not the country that did a lot of this stuff. But as a culture, they still have a lot to answer for. I mean, Japan does have a lot of racism, even today. I have a former student who's African American that spent a year in Japan, and she loved it, by the way. She's ready to move there, but she said it was there. And the biggest thing, however, I think with Japan is the inability to acknowledge what they did. I know a lot of students and parents get tired of professors like me always talking negative about America. And I get it. Even times I'm like, oh my God, I'm tired of talking about negative stuff. But I think it is important to know what you did and to acknowledge what you did. In the same way when if you're an alcoholic, and you get over it, you talk about it and you talk about the thing, or, in church, you testify about the sins that you did so that, and I'm beyond that now. And I think it's important. So I actually feel it's very patriotic to be honest about our past, because a lot of countries like Japan, aren't allowed to. Japan is still yet to acknowledge a lot of what it did. It still has not apologized for most of what it did. And it's very hard to find propaganda from Japan, which is what this is. This is Japanese propaganda showing what the West will do to Japan. They'll just snatch us up and make us put us in their back pocket. It's very hard to find this. There's not a lot of it out there. They've kept most of this hidden. Unlike us, where we're very upfront about things that we did that we're not proud of anymore. They don't talk about this. So here are a few. Most of it's aimed more at Britain, because most of the stuff that survived is Japanese propaganda in India. And India was controlled still by Britain, and Indians were indeed exploited by Britain. So Japan made a big deal to try to get Indians on their side. They very much kind of openly said, "Isn't that horrible how this empire treated you?" Of course, Japan was hoping to make them part of their empire. But again, what's supposed to sort of be Churchill and the brutal behavior towards Indian people. And so you can free yourselves with the help of the Japanese. You know what? People are starving. The fat West is living off your labor. This is some of the propaganda that they often would send to American soldiers. They would drop this from planes and stuff. So as British and American soldiers were fighting in the Pacific, they're saying, "Don't you want to go back to your woman? She's waiting on you. She might sleep with somebody else if you don't go back to her. And look at what you're doing. You could be up there with your wonderful." Sorry about the crude. This is incredibly crude. I realize this. And look at these women. Again, the ugliness of this. And again, this is what Japanese people thought that the U.S. would do. That we would come over and literally slaughter everybody and kill all the children. And leave them starving. And this is why a lot of Japanese people, when we did finally arrive, a lot of them killed themselves. They were so scared of us because of this propaganda. And this is supposed to be the deaths of Asians at the hands of the English. And this is a Japanese tank with an American head mounted on it. You didn't see this happening in Europe, at least not between the combatants. You didn't see German tanks with American heads on it, or French tanks with German heads on it. And this is from an American magazine, Life magazine, from 1943. And I know it's hard to read, but you have a woman here, and she's writing a letter, and it says, "Arizona war worker writes her Navy boyfriend a thank you note for the Jap skull he sent her." So again, an American sailor, I don't know if he killed the person or not, but found the body, cut the head off, boiled the head, got all the flesh off and skin off, and bleached it, and then put it in the mail, addressed it to his girlfriend, and sent it. "I love you, babe. Here's the skull." And she said, "Oh, thank you. I love you too." And this is portrayed like, "Oh, isn't this great? Isn't this sweet?" Now, had that been a German skull, it would have been, "Oh, this is what barbarians do. This is what savages do." But because it's a Japanese skull, doesn't matter. That's what I'm talking about. There's a difference here. And again, it's funny because Japan portrayed themselves as the liberators of Asia. And this is how they were convincing Asian countries to join them. But of course, Japan, if you actually looked at what they were, they thought they were superior to everybody else, and they actually enslaved all the other peoples of Asia and set up things like sex stations and forced women to be sex slaves to Japanese soldiers. And of course, we've already talked about in the previous part of what happened in Nanking and the horrendous, behavior here. And of course, what they did to American soldiers. A lot of people forget that the day after Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the Philippines. The Philippines was part of the U.S. at that point. And it was kind of the second part of their attack on us. And they beheaded American soldiers. Over 10,000 died. 80,000 were taken prisoner, and 10,000 of them died. Many of them beheaded, tortured. Again, some of the most awful experiences experienced in the war by Americans actually happened in the Philippines. And again, it's not very well known today. And of course, that just added to the image of the Japanese as being a barbarous country. By the end of the war, spring of 1945, we pretty much had taken all of the main islands surrounding Japan. So we were using islands like Iwo Jima to bomb Japan every night. And for instance, on March 9th, 1945, over 300 planes flew over Tokyo and firebombed it. That means bombs that are designed to spark fires. Over 100,000 people were killed in that one night. Over the next couple of months, over 60 cities were bombed. Close to 1 million. Some people argue that it's well over 1 million. The problem is we'll probably never have an exact number. But close to 1 million people were killed, over 8 million homeless. And again, part of a conversation I sometimes have in class, and I know my US2 students are doing it this semester, and that is looking at the bomb and whether we should have done that or not, because we are the only country to ever drop a nuclear weapon on another country. And we dropped 2, of course, on Japan. And, there's still a debate about that. Should we have done this or not? And I know my US2 students are actually having that debate on the discussion. And it is complicated because if you're looking at total numbers of people who died, actually the firebombing of Tokyo is worse. And and again, it's not very well known today, at least by Americans. At one time this was considered a war crime. You weren't supposed to kill people that weren't soldiers. You weren't supposed to bomb cities. But as you can see, by the end of World War II, every country, England, France, Germany, Russia, United States, Japan, China, we're all doing this to each other. This is just the tragedy of modern war. And we were doing this to Dresden, Germany as well. So to some degree, is the atomic bomb any worse than what we were doing already and what everybody else was doing? So that's one argument. I'm very conflicted by that argument, by the way. I don't have a clear-cut answer myself. This is what Tokyo looked like after the firebombing. I mean, it looked like a nuclear bomb went off. It was so hot in some of these firebombings that bodies burn, blood will boil, literally. Fire tornadoes would start, melted metal. But of course, that summer of 1945, we were beginning to develop a secret weapon, atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. There were a couple different ways we were doing this, taking uranium and taking plutonium, and in one case, fusing. In other words, you take an atom and you fuse them together, or you split an atom. And of course, doing either of those methods, if you do it right with the right element, unleashing this force that's buried in an atom. You have neutrons and electrons and protons, and they sort of circle each other, and there's a bond there. But if you break that bond, you can unleash energy, and that was the theory people like Einstein were working on. Long before the war. And so taking these ideas, Germany was initially working on these ideas, which is why we started working on them. Ultimately, we finished, and there was a lot of debate. Should we drop these bombs or not? Truman had to make that decision. Some people said that we should have warned them first, and we did actually warn them, not real detail, but we did say, if you don't surrender, we are going to unleash untold damage on you. Some people said that we should have demonstrated the bomb first, but the problem was, what if it didn't work? There was some debate whether it would actually work or not. And what Truman's argument was, and there was also this argument that 1 million Americans might die. There's no real evidence that that's a real number, but hundreds of thousands of Americans and Japanese would have died. And Truman ultimately argument was, they didn't warn us at Pearl Harbor, we're not going to warn them at this. And so on August 6th, we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. The reason it was Hiroshima is actually they had several cities planned, but basically they picked cities. Officially, they said that they had military significance. That's not true. Why they picked these cities is these are cities that had not been bombed yet. So they, as one general said, maximum terror, which theoretically makes it a terrorist act. I mean, by definition, right? We dropped a bomb. About 70 to 80,000 died instantly. Another 15 to 20,000 would die over the next few months from radiation. No surrender. This is before and after of Hiroshima. A couple days later, we bombed Nagasaki. Again, no surrender. But it turned out that behind the scenes, actually, the emperor was getting ready to surrender. And ultimately, August, they did. This is, again, just where in Japan we're talking about. This is Europe after the war. So again, we talk about the atomic bombs, but we also forget that, it may not have been atomic bombs, but vast cities were completely destroyed in Europe as well. Some at the hands of Germans, some at the hands of the British, some at the hands of the US. But unlike World War One, as we go into Europe, we don't go home this time. And there's two reasons for that. One is we know from World War One that was a mistake to not have stayed. That's partly why we get a second World War. But it's also because of Russia. Russia clearly is not going home. They have taken over Eastern Europe, and if we don't stay, they're going to take over all of Europe, which is probably going to lead to World War III if we don't do something. So we're in Europe, and we're not going to go home. I get more into that in the Cold War lecture. Because really, it's hard to say when does World War II end and when does the Cold War begin. And it's hard to say this is exactly when it happened. But the other thing that happens is as we are liberating people, now we start to uncover some camps where people like this gentleman was. And suddenly there's something deeper clearly going on here that many Americans had no idea was going on. Russia is going to be the one that's going to uncover most of these concentration camps. But we do capture a few of these and liberate the people. And American soldiers could not believe what they were seeing. Again, we knew that the German government was going after people they considered racially inferior. We knew there were executions, but the level of the atrocity really was. There's a lot of debate how many in the government knew about this. We knew some. I'm not of the opinion that most people in the American government really knew the extent of this, and definitely your average person definitely did not. And so many Americans who they could not believe what they were seeing. I mean, literally walking skeletons. For most Americans, by the way, who weren't there, I mean, it was not until the 50s that the extent of this became known. I mean, this was not something that was like the next day when, oh my gosh, it was something that kind of unraveled over time before Americans really realized, oh my God, what happened? And the impact of racial ideas, the impact of intolerance, the impact of nationalism, started to really filter down. So when we think of the Holocaust, we tend to think of the Jews who were executed, and we should because they were by large the largest number. Over half of the people died in what we call the Holocaust, which holo means everything. Cost means burn, all burns. Holocaust used to be used, a big forest fire to talk about Holocaust. The firebombing of Tokyo is a Holocaust. But nowadays, that term is very specific for most people. In fact, I would recommend not using the term Holocaust unless you're talking about this event. That term didn't start to be used in that way until the late 50s, I think around 60, 61, when it sort of started showing up in textbooks as the term. But it wasn't only Jewish people who were executed. And, well, some were enslaved, others were just flat out executed, some were worked to death, some were worked and then executed. But this is the previous was the German chart. This is translated in English, but you do get a sense. These are, you talk about the markings, the Jewish star, but there are all kinds of markings for people. In fact, if anybody knows anything about for instance, the gay rights movement, they also talk about the pink triangle. That's a symbol of the gay rights movement. That comes from this, because many different peoples were taken away and executed by the Nazis. So, give you an example of some of the other peoples, and again, we're not talking people that died in war, died as POWs. These are specifically that were purposely executed. People who were gay, people of color. Most of these were people from what is now Namibia, who were part of German Southwest Africa. Many of them lived in Germany, so they were some of the first people to be executed. People of different ethnic groups like the Slovenes and the Serbs and the Poles. Over 3 million Russians were killed. The Roma, which most people would refer to as gypsies, but they're technically the Roma. People of the wrong politics, like people who were communists, people who were socialists, were executed. People of certain religions, like Jehovah's Witness. People with mental problems. Again, this is eugenics. This is the idea we're going to weed out inferior genes. So if you have mental problems, if you couldn't see, you couldn't hear, you couldn't walk, any kind of physical disailment, executed. So the idea is you don't pass on your genes. But of course, the largest group, well over 6 million, were people who were Jewish. So what we call anti-Semitism. Semite comes from the word Shem, the three sons of Noah, uh, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Shem was supposed to be the son from which Semites come from, Jewish people come from. That's where the origins of the word anti-Semitism, I think we've talked about it before, is unfortunately there's a deep history there. For some people who are anti-Semitic, it's about religion. In other words, for instance, most Christians are not anti-Semitic, of course, but those who are argue, and of course much of Europe used to be, is the idea that if you're Jewish post-Jesus, you're supposed to replace the Old Testament with the New Testament. You're supposed to replace what you believe with Jesus's teaching. So if you didn't replace it, you're rejecting Jesus. So there, historically, that was one reason to be against Jews. Many people, and you still hear this occasionally, that the Jews killed Jesus. They're Christ killers. They committed deicide. Of course, first off, Jesus was Jewish, and the Romans actually did it, of course. But I've always pointed out that part of the theology of Christianity is that Jesus had to die so he could then come back to life and be resurrected. He died for our sins, right? So from a Christian viewpoint, the Jews should be thanked for what they did. But that's not how many people saw it. So they were the Christ killers. Plus the idea that Jews were the chosen people. Again, the argument was, no, you're not. Jesus died, so we're all the chosen people. But it's not always about religion. Sometimes it's secular, this idea of this other group, this other culture. So there's this secular aspect to it. Because Jews traditionally were segregated. Here I'm talking about Europe, segregated away from mainstream society. They lived in their own neighborhoods that became known as ghettos. Ghetto is the Italian word for a Jewish neighborhood. Whenever people are segregated and aren't integrated, superstitions develop very quickly because you don't really know anything about them. And we always tend to fear what we don't understand. So again, I think I talked about this with the witch trials a little bit, the idea that they were suspected of doing horrible atrocities, kidnapping Christian children and drinking their blood and things like that. So all kinds of superstitions. They're cheap. They run all the banks. And that comes from, there was a period where no one was allowed to be a banker because Jesus kicked out the money lenders from the temple. So many Christians used to believe that Christians weren't supposed to lend money, which is what a bank does. So Jews were allowed to, the only ones allowed to be bankers. And there are some truths to that, but by the late 1700s, very few Jewish bankers still survive. And actually no major bank today is run by Jews, even though you still hear people say that. The idea that they're cheap and they hoard money, there's a kernel of truth to that, because they were not allowed to own land. They often were expelled from countries for fear. So you do need to make sure you save your money. Anybody that grew up with an uncertain future learns that. So again, there's these kernels of truth that evolved into these horrible anti-Semitic myths. And then, of course, by the early 20th century, you have this racial science, and I've put it in quotes, things like eugenics and social Darwinism that looked at again, there's a contradiction here that, they would first, I'll say, like Hitler would say, Jews are inferior people and they're ruining the racial stock. But then at the same time, they turn around and say they caused World War I and they're behind every major atrocity. And it's like, so are they inferior? But if they can do that, they clearly are superior. So as is often the case with these kinds of things, there's an internal contradiction here. But anyway, these are some of the reasons for anti-Semitism that Hitler did not create. He just exploited and took to new levels. Even in places like the United States, we have things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a Russian novel that many Americans assumed were real. Henry Ford published this, and it was supposed to be the secret meetings of Jewish leaders to take over the world. Hitler was a big fan of this book, by the way. And again, you look at a lot of the propaganda and popular culture in Germany, and they almost always would play the Jews as the people behind the scenes controlling everything. Even in the United States, the argument against the myth of the Zimmerman telegram, Zimmerman, oh, it's a Jew that did that. It's all World War I was a fake. So even in the U.S., we have some of this. And so as the Nazis rose, they talk about two groups of people: der Juden, the Jews, but also the subhumans, the Untermensch, which Jews were part of, but so were these other people. And over and over again in schools, you hear this. And I have a couple of clips of some of these films that would have played in movie theaters at this time, constantly referring to Jews as pests, as vermin, as rats, as again, vermin that needs to be executed and removed from society. And again, the propaganda constantly portrayed. Again, here you are, kind of primitive, but also taking all the money, and look at all the death that they are responsible for. And so the German soldiers, again, these are kids from, the time they were in kindergarten, a German word, by the way, kindergarten until the 40s when they became soldiers. They've been taught these are the enemies. And of course, when the Reichstag fire began, it was blamed on the Jews. But really, Reinhard Heydrich who was chief of police and security for the Nazi government. He was sometimes known as the man with the iron heart. There's really no one person that's in charge of the Holocaust, but he was the guy who began to organize this. He held a conference in 42, the Wannsee Conference. This is where they first used the term the final solution. This was just outside. This is a Berlin suburb in early January 1942. And some of the minutes of this have survived. And this was, at this point, Germans thought they were going to be successful at the war. What's sad is that as Germans are clearly losing the war, they actually sped up the Holocaust. But part of the minutes, the official minutes that survive, it talks about, under proper guidance in the course of the final solution, the Jews are to be allocated for appropriate labor in the East. Able-bodied Jews, separated according to sex, will be taken in large work columns to these areas to work on roads. We're talking about slavery here. In the course of which action, doubtless a large portion will be eliminated. The possible final remnant, if anybody survives this, in other words, will, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resistant portion, have to be treated accordingly, because it is the product of natural selection and would, if released, act as the seed of a new Jewish revival. So in other words, we're going to enslave the Jews. We're going to have to kill some of them right off the bat. But the ones that are strong, we're going to work them to death. And if they happen to survive that, then we'll eliminate them, because we can't have them survive and continue. So this is what becomes known as the final solution. And in fact, at one point, they talk about the practical execution of the final solution. Now, those are the official minutes. Heydrich, let me flip to one more slide. This is, we do have these documents today. But Adolf Eichmann was the second in charge under Heydrich. And he's the one that actually implemented all these ideas. This is him on the left, what he looked like at the time. This is when he was captured in the early 60s, what he looked like by that point. Eichmann was in charge at the meeting of taking these minutes. And Heydrich said, these can't be verbatim. Nothing too explicit. In fact, as Heydrich eventually, at the end of the war, will be captured and be held on trials for war crimes. And he says, how shall I put it? Certain overplain talk and jargon expressions had to be rendered into official language by me. In other words, in case we are captured, we want it to have some deniability. What's interesting about Eichmann, when we think of movies, we think of, again, Bond villains that are getting ready. We're going to destroy everybody. Ha, ha, ha. And when in reality, the way evil often happens, it's a lot of it's just logistics. And in fact, a lot of the documents are very boring. Okay, we have these people, we're going to move them here, and we're going to go here, and then we're going to accomplish this goal. And it's very banal. It's very boring. It's very bureaucratic. And Eichmann is the guy who made all this happen. And he was a pencil pusher. He was the guy signing documents. Hannah Arendt, who survived this, she wrote an essay during the trial of Eichmann in the 60s. A lot of people were struck by how boring he was. He was just like just a banker or something. He didn't seem like people wanted a villain with an evil face and an evil laugh. But she said, this is what evil looks like, the banality of evil. This is real evil, and it's easy to do it. You're working a job and you're just hitting enter and typing in documents and hitting enter. Maybe not even think about what are these documents about? They could be about the execution of people, and you're just I'm just doing my job. I'm just following orders. And this gets back to that term, evil prevails when good people do nothing, you know. But this is Eichmann's Wannsee list. This is where they basically were listing all the Jews and where we think they all are. And they said at the conference, we're going to scour Europe to eradicate all the Jews. So these are the numbers. By the way, the IBM company helped them come up with these numbers and keep track of these. An American computer company made money off doing this. And again, this gets back to the argument. This is Time magazine looking at Heydrich, the Gestapo executioner. So we knew some of this. The extent of it, we don't seem to have known. The initial executions initially were going to be people shooting with their guns, just shooting. Two things. One, by the way, the people who did this, none of them were forced to do this. The SS took only volunteers, because they did not want people saying, I was only following orders. And they could quit at any time. And so initially they were executing them by gun, but first off, it was a lot of bullets, took a lot of time. And psychologically, people just couldn't take it after a while. So using, Industrial Revolution techniques and science, they first started gassing them by taking big giant vans and trucks and putting people in the back and then piping the carbon monoxide into the back to kill them. But even that took a long time. So ultimately, they began to use at the concentration camps. They converted some of these to death camps, and they were using things like the shower stalls, where they would have showers every couple of days. So they got used to going into these rooms, and then one day they, instead of water coming out the pipes, it would be a gas. And this is the pipes that they could convert from water to gas if they needed to. And of course, the gas they used was a gas known as Zyklon B, which is a gas that was initially used as a rat poison. So they literally used rat poison to kill Jews. And in the first case, they started burying the bodies, but as the war got closer to ending, they started burning the bodies in gas ovens. Again, you would think that as the war was getting over with, Germany would go, okay, stop, pretend we're not doing this. Instead, Germany, knowing they were going to lose, the leaders actually sped up the process. The argument was, well, we might lose, but at least we'll get rid of the Jews before we lose. Fortunately, they were not able to complete the process. And so when Americans and Russians began to liberate these camps, they could not believe what they were seeing. This went so far beyond what they thought. And, as many American veterans said that were at these camps, they really realized what this war was about. And it does have a profound change on America, not just American culture, world culture. Again, one of the worst things you could be today is to be racist, right? This is why. Because, people say, what's the harm? I just don't like those people. Well, if you take eugenics, racism, nationalism to its logical end, this is what you wind up with. This is eugenics. This is racism truly. This is nationalism truly. So, and this is why, not to get on my soapbox, but I guess I am, the job of us historians and you people, as you're going to be parents and raising kids, remember this. So we, obviously we don't repeat it. The word that used to be used as a Holocaust, and in Jewish communities, sometimes it's still the word of Shoah, where at least 6 million Jews specifically, it's the largest execution of any one group ever. And hopefully it never will be repeated again. When the Americans found out what was going on, they forced the local German residents who had to have known, to force them through the camps so they could never say they didn't know about it. And then also force them to dig up the bodies and bury them again. And that's what's going on here. All right, finally to the end. So by the end of the war in 1945. U.S. was the world power by this point. And which is why the last part of the class, the Cold War, it's really about the U.S. But Russia was right behind us. They were almost equal to us, not quite. Um, we no longer are in a depression, but the rest of the world still is. Germany, Italy, Japan ruined, along with much of Asia and Europe. The British Empire by 1948 will be totally gone. And of course, fascism as a major option worldwide really ends. We still have dictators, but fascism truly ends here, which is why it's so scary that I've heard young people in the last 4 or 5 years talk about fascism again. Again, we're getting 2 or 3 generations since World War II. We're getting to a period where we can romanticize it and start telling myths about it, which, again, now it's up to you guys to make sure the memory stays. Okay, enough of that. Thank you guys, and whenever you're ready to hear me yet again, I know this is going to be brutal. Move on to Cold War now. Okay, thanks, guys.